However, we can also, I think, maintain that Mingei was nevertheless central to the conception of this home. This is an article about this house that appeared in the 1954 issue of an architectural magazine called Modern Living, Modern Living. And you can see that the very first page of the article focuses not so much on the construction of the house, but with a photograph of the dining table in the house, which is set with a very handsome collection of Mingei pottery, including items, and they're all listed here, from the well-known Mingei kilns of Onta in Kyushu, Tsuboya in Okinawa, and also works by Hamada Shoji. This is another house designed, a private home designed by Ito, that was also featured in the same magazine, excuse me, in July 1955. And this house is actually called a Mingei Cho no Sumai, so it's actually a Mingei-style dwelling. However, these private homes, designed in the Mingei style, were of course restricted to the very wealthy few, and in this sense they do not represent necessarily any kind of broader, much less mass level of popularity for Mingei. However, we also see developing at the same time, and by the same architects actually, in the 1950s, an increasingly generic Mingei style of commercial architecture and design. And these were to be found in proliferating new public spaces for consumption, namely restaurants, cafes, and bars. So what we see here is a soba restaurant. It's actually called a Mingei soba restaurant. I'm not sure what Mingei noodles are exactly, but this is a soba restaurant in Osaka, which was designed and built in the mid to late 1950s by another architect named Miyaji Yonezo, and he too, like Ito, specialized in Mingei style architecture. Okay, here is a photograph of the interior of this restaurant, Shinobu-an. And I don't know if you can see here, but it's filled, not to say cluttered, with Mingei objects. It also has this particular type of ceiling, which is considered characteristic of a certain kind of Minka architecture. This is hard to see here, but if you look at the original photograph, this is a Serizawa calendar. Here are some fans. This type of furniture, which might not seem especially Mingei to you, was actually made in Matsumoto in Nagano-ken, where there was a certain type of Mingei furniture that was being created that was actually very influenced by British furniture, so there's a connection right there. This restaurant was, by the way, extremely successful. And it was so much so that another branch was opened a year or so later and featured in a magazine on commercial architecture. So this is the second branch of Shinobu-an, and it opened in the basement mall of an Osaka building. I think it's the Mainichi building in 1959. So if you can imagine, this is actually underground in a kind of, if you've been to Japan, you've been to department stores or these underground food court areas where there are lots of little restaurants next to each other. So this is a sort of vaguely farmhouse type exterior lined up with a bunch of other restaurants. And here again, the interior, we have this sort of rather dark wood furniture along with lots of Mingei objects, making it a Mingei restaurant. So there were a number of so-called Mingei restaurants in Tokyo also. The same magazine featured this establishment in 1958. This was a tea house, a Mingei chabo, called Suzuya. and it was in Shinjuku in Tokyo, and this is from 1958. And here we see, this was not designed by an architect, but rather by a construction company. And this is what I mean when I say this Mingei style was becoming somewhat generic. This is the Katsura Construction Company. And again, we have a kind of version of this farmhouse type half timbering on the exterior. And here is a photograph of a room inside the restaurant, which was called the ochazuke room. I guess it was where you ate ochazuke. And the ochazuke room was something that this restaurant was particularly proud of, and you can see here, I'm sorry about the quality of this photograph, it's from a magazine, some examples of Mingei pottery. So in most cases, as we've seen, this style, the Mingei style as it was developing in the 50s, at least architecturally, consisted largely of Mingei-style furniture and objects in a kind of quasi-minka or quasi-farmhouse context. And as such, it may not appear especially modern or modernist. And yet both Ito and Miyaji, these two architects, understood their designs for Mingei-style residences and restaurants to be very modern and to represent the adaptation of Mingei to late 20th century or mid-20th century life and sensibilities. And similarly, the editors of the magazine that featured these restaurants, Shoten Kenshiku, they chose these particular restaurants because they considered them to be not only very successful commercially, but also very distinctively modern. I want to turn now to another category of folk modernist consumerism. How am I doing on time, by the way? 2 minutes, okay. So very quickly, I'm going to turn to my most fun example, which is clothing, and particularly kimono and yukata for women. And I will note here that women represented an especially active and important sector of the market for Mingei and folk modernism in the late 1950s and beyond, as they do, of course, generally in modern consumerism. So just very quickly, the period after World War II was a time of great change, obviously, and one of the most obvious changes was the sartorial change. Japanese women before 1945 dressed predominantly in Japanese-style clothing. After 1945, some people thought it happened almost overnight. Japanese women, old and young, switched to Western-style clothing, or kind of versions of Western-style clothing. And that's sort of been the conventional understanding. But I think that something that tends to be a little overlooked is that there was a resurgence of kimono in the 1950s. And there was a kind of significant counter-trend of rising interest among women, and especially younger women, who had not necessarily grown up wearing kimono, in this traditional style of Japanese dress. But I would point out that the kind of kimono that were becoming popular were actually quite new and even modern or modern. And this is another subject that needs a lot more study. I've only just recently begun to look into it myself, but I'll just point out that Mingei was becoming a source of inspiration for this kind of kimono. So this, as you can just see here, is Mingei Cho no Aigata kimono. Okay, so this is a so-called Mingei-style kimono that's being featured at the very beginning of a deluxe kimono magazine called Utsukushi Kimono that began publication in 1953. And just very quickly, the caption here suggests that there's something very classical about the cloth, because it is in fact a Mingei-type cloth, and yet the emphasis is on how very modern this kimono is. So the caption says, this is a kimono with a vitality that is classical and yet also feels extremely modern. While the color combination is simple, there is a showy and bright feeling which perfectly suits the modern way of dressing. So the caption is stressing this. It's also suggested by the use of this very well-known model named Helen Higgins, who was actually half Japanese, but who had very Caucasian-looking features and a figure. And this too, I argue, would have suggested the modern to a 1950s Japanese audience. I think I'm running out of time. I'll just show the same kimono in the same magazine with a short red koto, which was designed by a woman named Otsuka Sueko. And Otsuka Sueko was a very important person in the refiguring of kimono, in the creation of something she called new kimono in the 1950s and 1960s. And this, by the way, is a photograph of the rather elegant Otsuka herself, dressed in a kimono, as she called it, of her own design. She worked for several years in the early 1950s at Takumi, the Mingei shop in Tokyo, and she used Mingei textiles there, including fabrics by Mingei artist craftsmen such as Yanagi Yoshitaka, and also the dyer printer Serizawa Keisuke. And her work became very, very popular, and it received a lot of attention. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to whiz through these, but these are two kimono, also featured in Utsukushi Kimono, using fabric by Serizawa Keisuke. So these are kataezome, not katazome, because he made them and he made his own stencils. And what's interesting is, you can't really read it, but the caption by the editors of this magazine, they're calling this bingata. And my friend Amanda Stinchcomb assures me that this is not bingata. I mean, it's kind of like bingata, but it's a very different color palette. And I would suggest that it's very modern in a number of ways. And this point, I think, is made even more clearly by this kimono, which is from the same article, in which the editors are calling it not bingata, but bingata fu. So they're saying it's fun bingata style kimono. And I think here we really see a good example of a modernist reworking of an original Mingei inspiration. I have here an example of real bingata, if you will, and this is a 19th century kimono from the Mingei-kan collection. And I included it just so you can see the contrast between the two. The designer here, who is not Serizawa, has enlarged and stylized the bingata theme of flying geese against mountains, and also used a very different modern color palette to create a much bolder and more graphic and tanoshi, fun design. And I'll just mention in closing that all of these photos were taken, you can maybe just make it out here, at Katsura, which refers to the Katsura Rikyu, or the Katsura Detached Palace in Kyoto. And of course, as many of you may know, this is a 17th century structure that beginning in the 1930s became celebrated internationally for what many considered to be its kind of pre-modern modernism. Bruno Taut, the German architect, was among those who really sort of spread this notion. So by the 1950s, this idea of the Katsura Rikyu as an example of a kind of indigenous modernism was widely promoted within Japan as well as abroad. Okay, I have a lot more, but I think I'm going to stop here, and you get the general drift of my comments. So thank you very much for your kind attention.